Hi there, my name is Mark Miles from RTO Leadership Institute, and we just wanted to do a quick video because one of the biggest challenges that people have is essentially designing and developing assessment tools. It is not an easy task and it can be quite lengthy. There can be a lot of details that you would need to go through, and there's a lot of compliance and regulations that we must meet when we're designing and developing assessment tools. But what I thought I would do is simply go through an example unit for you to show you some methodical ways that you can actually develop your assessments in a way that's going to be quite, aligned to the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence, and it's going to give you some insight and hopefully it'll simplify things for you quite a bit. Okay, now as I go through this example, you may want to have the unit BSB CMM 401 make a presentation in front of you as I go through this example. Okay, so one of the very first things that we need to do is we need to get the unit and we need to get it off training.gov.au. Okay, so hypothetically, someone said to you, I want you to design and develop some assessment tools for the unit, make a presentation. So we'd go to training.gov.au and we would find that unit. We'd print it off, and I particularly like to print it off in one document. So I'll just print it off. I don't like to print it off in two separate documents because it can be a little bit harder to follow. I'll normally just right click and press print page, and then I'll get everything I need. Okay, now I definitely want to get all the performance criteria. I want to get the performance evidence and the knowledge evidence, and particularly the assessment conditions. Okay, so what is stage one? What's the first thing that we need to do when we're designing and developing assessment tools? Well, let's cut straight to the chase. The first thing that we want to look at is actually the assessment conditions. Okay, the assessment conditions. So ultimately, these are the conditions under which the unit must be assessed, and if we don't meet these conditions, then it's going to be non-compliant. Okay, so in this case of make a presentation, it says that it must be assessed in a safe environment where evidence gathered demonstrates consistent performance of typical activities experienced by the individuals using interpersonal communication skills in the workplace, and include access to equipment, materials, and business software packages for making a presentation. It includes business technology, and it includes interaction with others. So based on those conditions, we need to fulfill the requirements of it being in a safe environment, the candidates actually interacting with other people, and also access to software packages. Okay, so would it be okay to not use software? Well, possibly, but probably not. Okay, so we do need to have some aspect of some electronic resources in there. Okay, so now let's come up to the next step. Now the next step that we want to do is we want to start to look at the performance criteria, and we want to get a sense of what's actually required for the unit, and we want to start to read through the performance criteria. Next thing that I like to do is read through the performance evidence, because ultimately the performance evidence tells us, exactly what we need to see someone do or have evidence of someone having done after the unit is complete. Okay, so for anyone that's familiar with the old style of unit, the performance evidence is kind of like the critical aspects of assessment. Okay, so performance evidence, we want to read through that. Now in this case, if we read through the performance evidence, obviously I'm not going to read the entire unit to you, but for example, we have performance evidence: prepare and deliver presentations related to occupational area of interest which demonstrate the use of, okay, effective presentation strategies and communication principles, aids and materials to support the presentation. Okay, now although in the unit it says if not specified, one instance is enough, in here it does say performance evidence, prepare and deliver presentations related to occupational area of interest. So for me, I'm going to infer that probably getting someone to deliver maybe 2 presentations is probably safer than getting them to do just one. Okay, that's just my gut feel around it. Now, so we've looked at the assessment conditions, we've looked at the performance criteria, we've looked at the performance evidence. Now the next thing that I like to do is I like to map it. So I'm going to look at each of the performance criteria and I'm going to make an executive decision. I'm going to decide exactly how I think would be the best way to assess those items. So for example, performance criteria 1.1, plan and document presentation approach and intended outcomes. So plan and document presentation approach and intended outcomes. So what I'm going to decide is what would be the best way to assess that. Would it be a written test, a verbal test? Would an observation checklist be the best way to do that? And in this case, plan and document presentation approach and intended outcomes. Probably I'm going to go a written test on that one. So what I'm actually going to do is on the unit itself, I'm actually going to write next to 1.1, I'm going to write WT. And that's going to remind me that when I come to doing my official mapping, that I'm going to assess that via written test. Okay, now let's pick another one, 1.3, okay? Select presentation aids, materials and techniques that suit the format and purpose of the presentation and will enhance audience understanding of key concepts and central ideas. That one as well, I'm going to go observation on that, okay? So next to that, I'm going to write OBS, okay, observation. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, next to every single performance criteria, every single required performance evidence and knowledge evidence, I'm going to write how I'm going to assess it, whether it's a role play or a written test or an observation. And I'm just going to make some executive decisions as I go through. Later on, I could come back and change that, absolutely. But I'm going to make those decisions, okay? Then, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make my assessment plan and fill out all of those details. And I'm going to make sure that what I'm thinking is going to marry up to the characteristics of the audience that I'm going to be assessing. Okay, now, next, the fun part is we're actually going to make the assessment tools. Okay, so the first tool or the assessment instrument that we're going to make is the observation checklist. Okay, now, an observation checklist, you can't fall into the trap of just rewording the performance criteria. You can't do that, okay? And ASCA will find you non-compliant for doing that. And ultimately, if you gave that to an assessor, they're going to really struggle to actually understand what they need to see when they're observing the candidate do something, okay? So let me just fix the camera there for a second. So if I was going to make the observation checklist, I'm going to put it into wording that's going to make sense to the assessor at the time. So let me pick an example. All right, so previously I mentioned 1.3. I'm going to use that as an example, and I'm going to say that I'm going to assess 1.3 through observation. So let me just read it for you. Select presentation aids, materials, and techniques that suit the format and purpose of the presentation and will enhance audience understanding of key concepts and central ideas. So if I was going to turn that into an observation statement, I would make it sound something like, while giving presentation, candidate uses appropriate presentation aids and materials that suit the format and purpose of the presentation. Okay, so I'll say that again. While delivering presentation, candidate uses presentation aids and materials that suit the format of the presentation. Okay, now another one could be, because I may create another criteria on that as well to assess 1.3, and it may be presentation aids were used successfully. Okay, now that's just another one that we could add in to ensure that we assess 1.3 quite thoroughly. Okay, now there's no limit to the number of, I guess, items that you may match up with each of the performance criteria, and you may assess a performance criteria with multiple items, but ultimately you need to make the executive decision, have you covered the entire unit itself? Okay, so what you would do is you would then move on to your next observation item. And so let's pick another example. 2.1, explain and discuss desired outcomes of the presentation with target audience. Okay, so I've read 2.1 for that one. So if you were going to make that into an observation checklist item, it may sound something like, at the beginning of the presentation, the candidate discussed the desired outcomes and explained outcomes to the audience. And that would form a tick box on the checklist, okay? So what you would do is for each of the observation items that you've allocated on the unit, you're going to turn that into an observable item, okay? Now you're going to do that for the performance criteria, for the performance evidence, and maybe even some of the knowledge evidence, but probably the knowledge evidence most today is going to be a written test or a verbal test, okay? So now, let's move on and let's look at the written test. Okay, let's look at creating a written test. Now with a written test, it needs to be very level appropriate. Okay, so for example with use unit, although we don't like to assign levels to things, this unit itself, make a presentation, you're probably going to find it in more Certificate 3, Cert 4, diploma level qualifications. You probably wouldn't find it in Cert 1, 2 or 3. Okay, so when we make our questions, they need to be quite level appropriate. Okay, so let's come back and performance criteria 1.1, it said plan and document presentation approach and intended outcomes. Now if we wanted to assess that via written test, we could ask a question such as, how would you ensure that you effectively plan for your upcoming presentations? Okay. Now, that could be one way to handle it. However, we could ask that performance criteria in multiple ways. Okay. Now, let me head over to the knowledge evidence, and I'm going to give you some examples of how you could tackle the knowledge evidence. Okay. Naturally, we need to make sure that we're going to cover absolutely everything in the unit, but I just want to give you some examples, right? Now, with the knowledge evidence, alright, so what have we got here? I like to label things, so PE1, PE2, PE3, PE4 would be the performance evidence. Knowledge evidence, similarly, I'm going to put KE1, KE2, KE3, KE4. Okay, so let's take a look. We've got KE1, which is identify information collection methods that will support review and feedback of presentations. Okay, KE2, identify regulatory and organizational obligations and requirements relevant to presentations. KE3, describe the principles of effective communication. KE4, describe the range of presentation aids and materials available to support presentations. Alright, so now let's tackle KE1. Identify information collection methods that will support review and feedback of presentations. So we could turn that into a question, and the question would be something like, what are 3 ways that you could gather feedback after your presentations? Another one could be, let's see, summarize 3 ways that you would know that your presentation had been a success. Or another one could be, outline a system that you could put into place with your audiences so that you could gather feedback. Okay. Now, there is no such thing as a perfect question, and that's why we do validations, to continually modify and polish our questions to get them closer and closer to meeting the requirements of the unit. Okay, so now let me think of another one. Let's take a look at KE3 and let me run another example for you. Describe the principles of effective communication. Okay, so if we wanted to assess that via a written test, we could say something like, what are 6 characteristics of effective communication in a presentation? Or, how would you ensure that your communication was very effective throughout your presentations? Or, in 200 words, describe in your last presentation how you made sure that your messages were clear and effectively understood. Okay? So what we're trying to do is we've got this criteria, we've got this thing that we're assessing, and we're going to create a question that would test that item, if that makes sense. Okay, now let's pick another one, KE4. All right, and I'm going to create a question on KE4. Hopefully you're playing along and reading along as we do this. Describe the range of presentation aids and materials available to support presentations. So that could be something like, okay, what is one of your favorite presentation aids to use, and why do you love to use that? Or, how do you ensure that you effectively use presentation aids in your sales presentations? Or, what are 3 presentation aids that you can use, and why do you recommend people use them? Okay, whatever it might be. Now, keep in mind, if it was a Cert 1 unit, we'd probably go true or false questions. Cert 2 would probably do multiple choice. Cert 3 would probably do how questions or steps questions, things like that. And Cert 4, we're looking for outline, define, summarize, what is and why type questions. And Diploma, we're looking for analyze, recommend, and really deeper level thought on the answers that we might be looking for. Okay. Now, we've gone ahead and we've looked at the assessment conditions. We've looked at the performance evidence. We've mapped it accordingly. And we've looked at the observation items. And we've made our observation checklist by making statements, all right? And next we made a written test by making questions, okay? Now, of course, we can also make a role play. We could also make a case scenario. We could do a number of different ways, okay? Now, after we've designed our tools, next thing, of course, we want to make sure that we cover off the dimensions of competency, and we want to make sure that we cover off the principles of assessment and cover off the validity, the flexibility, the reliability, and the fairness. But next thing we want to do is trial it. Okay, so we're going to write it all up, and we're going to create our instructions for each of the assessment instruments, such as we want the instructions for the observation checklist, we want the instructions for the written test, or the instructions for the role plays, things like that. Okay. Then we're going to trial it with a candidate and get some feedback on it and see what they thought, and see if they could understand everything that was required of them. Okay, and that process is extremely helpful to know if what we've actually intended has come across on paper. Okay, so hopefully this video has been helpful for you. Ultimately, it is a process that we get better and better at over time. And the better your questions get, the easier it is for your candidates to answer them. Okay, so thank you so much for watching this video. Hope it's been helpful. And if you have any questions at all about instructional design words, how to make really, I guess, level appropriate questions and how to contextualize them to the workplace, feel free to give us a call, send us an email, and we are more than happy to help you out. Thanks so much for watching. Bye for now.